In October 2009, Ghost Adventures became the first American television crew granted permission to investigate Poveglia Island, Italy, a location so dangerous the Italian government banned public access for decades. Subscribe now because what happened during the 3-day investigation forced Italian authorities to evacuate the crew immediately, resulted in international diplomatic incidents, sent Zak Baggens to the hospital with unexplained injuries, and led to Italy permanently revoking all future filming permits. The footage captured was so controversial that portions still cannot be aired in Europe. This is what really happened at Poveglia Island that forced production to stop, and why Zak calls it the most evil place he has ever investigated. Poveglia Island sits in the Venetian lagoon between Venice and Lido in northern Italy, a small island covering approximately 17 acres that has been completely abandoned and off-limits to the public since 1968, when the last facility operating there, a psychiatric hospital with a horrific reputation, was permanently closed by Italian authorities. The island's history spans over 1,500 years and is soaked in death, disease, and documented human suffering on a scale that few locations on Earth can match. During the Roman Empire, Poveglia served as a quarantine station for plague victims, a place where the sick were sent to die away from the healthy population of Venice. When the bubonic plague swept through Europe multiple times between the 14th and 18th centuries, Poveglia became Venice's primary plague island, where victims were forcibly taken to prevent disease spread. Historical records suggest over 160,000 plague victims died on Poveglia across multiple outbreaks, their bodies burned in massive pits that still scar the island's landscape. The soil of Poveglia is estimated to contain approximately 50% human ash from these mass cremations. In 1793, the island was repurposed as a quarantine station for ships arriving in Venice, where crews and passengers showing any signs of illness were detained, often dying during quarantine. Then, in 1922, the Italian government constructed a psychiatric hospital on the island to house Venice's mentally ill population away from the mainland. This hospital would become legendary for its cruelty and experimental treatments. The hospital's chief physician, whose name has been documented, but whose full records remain sealed by the Italian government, allegedly conducted brutal experiments on patients, including lobotomies performed without anesthesia, experimental shock treatments, and surgical procedures testing theories about mental illness that had no scientific basis. Patients reported seeing ghosts of plague victims throughout the hospital grounds. Many claimed the island itself was driving them more insane. The physician allegedly became obsessed with the spirits he believed haunted the island, claiming they were communicating with him and guiding his experimental work. In 1946, according to hospital records and local legend, the physician either jumped or was pushed from the hospital's bell tower, falling to his death. The hospital continued operating until 1968, when it was permanently closed amid rumors of patient abuse, unexplained deaths, and staff refusing to work there due to paranormal activity. Since closure, Poveglia has been completely abandoned and strictly off-limits. The Italian government prohibits anyone from visiting without explicit permission. Local Venetians refuse to go near it. Fishermen avoid the waters around the island. It is considered cursed, evil, and genuinely dangerous. For decades, paranormal investigators and television productions from around the world had attempted to gain access to Poveglia Island to investigate its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in Europe, and every single request had been denied by Italian authorities, who maintained strict prohibition against any public or media access to the property. The island was government-owned, technically under the jurisdiction of the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, and was considered both a historical site and a public safety hazard due to deteriorating structures. Requests from major television networks, documentary filmmakers, and paranormal research organizations had all been rejected without exception. Then, in 2009, Ghost Adventures managed to accomplish what no other production had achieved. They secured official permission to conduct a paranormal investigation on Poveglia Island and film for their television series. How they obtained this unprecedented access has never been fully explained publicly. Zak Baggens has mentioned in interviews that it required months of negotiation, involvement of Italian officials at multiple government levels, legal agreements and liability waivers, substantial fees paid to Italian authorities, and commitments about how the footage would be used and what would be shown about Italy. The permission came with extremely strict conditions. The crew would be allowed 3 days and 2 nights on the island maximum. They would be accompanied at all times by Italian government representatives who had authority to shut down filming immediately if any conditions were violated. Certain areas of the island were completely off limits, including specific sections of the old hospital and the bell tower where the physician had died. All footage would be reviewed by Italian authorities before being allowed to leave the country. The crew had to sign agreements accepting full responsibility for any injuries or incidents that occurred. And perhaps most significantly, they had to agree that if Italian authorities ordered them to leave at any point for any reason, they would evacuate immediately without argument, and all footage would be confiscated. Zak, Aaron Goodwin, and Nick Groff arrived in Italy in October 2009 with a scaled-down crew due to the restrictions on how many people could be on the island simultaneously. They brought standard Ghost Adventures equipment, including night vision cameras, digital audio recorders, EMF meters, and thermal imaging cameras. The plan was to conduct the most thorough investigation possible within the 3-day window, focusing on the psychiatric hospital ruins, the plague pits, and any other areas where activity had been historically reported. Italian officials transported them to the island by boat. As they approached, the crew noted that even the boat operators seemed nervous about getting too close to Poveglia. The island appeared exactly as one would imagine a cursed abandoned plague island and asylum would look. Overgrown vegetation consuming crumbling buildings, the bell tower rising above ruins like a skeletal finger, an overwhelming sense of decay and abandonment. The Ghost Adventures crew established their base camp in what had been the administrative section of the psychiatric hospital, one of the few areas where the roof remained mostly intact and where Italian authorities deemed it relatively safe to set up equipment. The plan for the first night was to conduct preliminary EVP sessions, survey the grounds, and identify areas of highest activity for more intensive investigation on subsequent nights. However, within hours of arriving on Poveglia, Zak Baggens began experiencing severe physical symptoms that came on suddenly and without any apparent medical cause. Zak developed an intense headache that he described as feeling like his skull was being crushed from the inside. He became nauseous to the point of vomiting multiple times. His body temperature spiked, giving him a fever that registered over 102 degrees Fahrenheit, despite him showing no signs of infection or illness before arriving on the island. Most concerning, Zak began experiencing visual disturbances, including seeing dark shadows moving in his peripheral vision and having difficulty focusing his eyes. The Italian medical observer, who was required to be present, became concerned enough to suggest evacuating Zak back to the mainland for proper medical evaluation. Zak refused, insisting the symptoms were related to the island's energy rather than physical illness, and that he needed to continue the investigation. He took fever-reducing medication and tried to push through the symptoms. As night fell and the crew began their formal investigation, Zak's condition worsened rather than improved. During an EVP session in what had been the hospital's surgical wing, Zak became disoriented and aggressive, behaviors completely out of character that alarmed both Aaron and Nick, who had worked with him for years. Zak began speaking about wanting to hurt himself, describing intrusive thoughts about jumping from the bell tower, and expressing hatred toward the crew members who were trying to help him. This sudden psychological shift from physical symptoms to violent ideation happened within minutes. Nick Groff made the decision to physically remove Zak from the building, essentially dragging him outside despite Zak's resistance. Once outside in the open air away from the hospital structure, Zak's symptoms began improving almost immediately. The violent thoughts decreased. His fever started dropping. The headache reduced from crushing intensity to manageable pain. Within 30 minutes of being outside, Zak was coherent enough to recognize that something about the hospital building itself had triggered an acute reaction. The Italian authorities present were disturbed by what they had witnessed and informed the crew that if any similar incidents occurred, the investigation would be terminated immediately. They were already questioning whether allowing this investigation had been a mistake. Despite Zak's health crisis on the first night, the crew continued investigating Poveglia Island on day 2, focusing their efforts on areas outside the main hospital building where Zak's symptoms had been most severe. They conducted investigations in the ruins of the older plague quarantine buildings, near the documented locations of mass burial pits, and along the island's shoreline where bodies had reportedly been brought ashore by the thousands during plague outbreaks. The evidence they captured during these investigations was substantial and unprecedented in its clarity and consistency. Digital audio recorders captured EVP responses in Italian that, when translated, appeared to be direct answers to questions the crew was asking. During one session, Aaron asked in English, "How many people died here?" and the recorder captured a response in Italian that translated to "tutti morti," all dead. When Nick asked, "What happened to the patients in the hospital?" the response captured was "esperimenti," experiments. These weren't ambiguous sounds that might be interpreted as words. They were clear voices speaking recognizable Italian words and phrases. Thermal imaging cameras detected human-shaped heat signatures moving through areas where no living people were present. The signatures showed temperature variations consistent with human bodies but appeared and disappeared in seconds, moving through walls and structures in ways that living people physically couldn't. EMF meters registered massive electromagnetic field spikes in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than environmental interference. The spikes would occur in direct response to questions, creating what appeared to be communication through electromagnetic manipulation. Most disturbing to the Italian officials observing the investigation was footage captured in the ruins of the old crematorium where plague victims' bodies had been burned. The camera showed what appeared to be dozens of shadowy figures moving among the ruins, far more activity than the crew had encountered at any other location they had investigated. The figures appeared aware of the camera and investigators, moving toward them in ways that suggested curiosity or possibly hostility. Italian authorities viewing this footage in real time became visibly uncomfortable and began discussing among themselves in Italian whether the investigation should continue. The crew didn't understand the rapid Italian conversation, but Nick noticed the officials seemed agitated. That night, during a formal investigation session in one of the quarantine buildings, something happened that convinced the Italian authorities this investigation had gone too far and needed to stop immediately. The crew was conducting an EVP session when all their equipment simultaneously malfunctioned. Every camera, every audio recorder, every EMF meter shut off at exactly the same moment despite being on different power sources and different battery types. This shouldn't be physically possible. Then in the darkness with all equipment dead, everyone present, including the Italian officials, heard what they described as dozens or hundreds of voices speaking at once in overlapping Italian. Some screaming, some crying, some saying words they couldn't make out. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding them completely. On the morning of the third and final day of the investigation, Zak Baggens made a decision that would ultimately force an immediate shutdown of all production and result in the crew being evacuated from Poveglia Island by Italian authorities who declared the investigation over and demanded all footage be turned over for government review. Despite explicit warnings that the bell tower was completely off limits due to both structural instability and its historical association with the physician's death, and despite the Italian officials making it clear that entering the tower would violate their agreement and end the investigation, Zak became obsessed with accessing the tower. He expressed to Aaron and Nick that he felt compelled to go inside, that something was calling him there, and that the investigation would be incomplete without exploring the location where the hospital's most infamous death had occurred. Nick and Aaron both argued against it, reminding Zak of the restrictions and the potential consequences. The Italian officials explicitly denied permission and stated that any attempt to enter the tower would result in immediate evacuation and possible legal charges for violating the agreement. But Zak's obsession intensified rather than decreased when told he couldn't go. He began expressing the same concerning psychological patterns from the first night: aggression, irrational thinking, expressing thoughts about death and jumping from heights. Nick later stated in interviews that it was clear Zak wasn't thinking rationally, that something about the island and particularly the tower was affecting his judgment and personality in dangerous ways. In the early afternoon, while Italian officials were occupied with other matters and before anyone could stop him, Zak entered the bell tower through a damaged section of the exterior wall. Aaron followed with a camera trying to document what was happening and possibly pull Zak back out. What happened inside the tower during the approximately 8 minutes Zak was in there has been partially documented through Aaron's camera footage, but significant portions of the footage have never been aired and reportedly remain restricted by Italian authorities. What is known from released footage and crew testimony: Zak climbed the interior staircase toward the top of the tower despite Aaron calling for him to stop. The staircase was severely deteriorated and structurally unsafe. As Zak climbed higher, his behavior became more erratic. He began talking to himself or to something invisible, having a conversation where his side was captured on camera but no responses were audible. He discussed jumping from the tower, stating, "He wants me to jump, and I can see them all down there waiting." When Zak reached the level where the physician allegedly jumped or fell to his death in 1946, he stood at the opening looking down at the ground far below. Aaron was screaming for him to step back from the edge. On camera, Zak can be seen swaying as if about to fall or jump. Then something happened that Aaron later described as the most terrifying moment of his entire Ghost Adventures career. Zak turned away from the opening and his face showed an expression that Aaron said wasn't Zak. Different eyes, different expression, like someone else was looking through Zak's face. Then Zak collapsed suddenly, falling backward away from the opening and hitting his head on the stone floor. When Zak collapsed in the bell tower, Aaron immediately called for help while trying to assess whether Zak was seriously injured and attempting to prevent him from falling further down the damaged staircase. Italian officials, alerted that the restricted bell tower had been entered in violation of explicit orders, rushed to the scene along with the medical observer. They found Zak unconscious with a head wound bleeding from where he had struck the stone floor. The medical observer assessed that Zak required immediate evacuation to the mainland for proper medical care, including potential CT scan to rule out serious head injury or skull fracture. Italian authorities were furious that their explicit restrictions had been violated, viewing it not just as a breach of agreement but as disrespect for Italian law and cultural heritage protections. An emergency boat was called to evacuate Zak to Venice, where an ambulance was waiting to transport him to the hospital. While Zak was being evacuated, Italian officials informed Nick Groff and Aaron Goodwin that the investigation was terminated immediately. All equipment must be packed and all footage must be surrendered to Italian authorities for review before any of it could leave the country. This was the scenario the crew had been warned about but had hoped to avoid. Aaron and Nick had no choice but to comply. All cameras, all audio recorders, all equipment was confiscated. The crew was escorted off the island under what amounted to armed guard and transported back to Venice, where they were informed they had 24 hours to leave Italy or face possible criminal charges for violation of the Cultural Heritage Site Agreement. At the hospital in Venice, Zak underwent CT scanning and neurological evaluation. The head wound required stitches, but the scan showed no skull fracture or brain bleeding. However, doctors noted Zak had symptoms beyond what the head injury would explain: continued fever, disorientation, memory gaps where he couldn't recall portions of what happened in the tower, and reported auditory hallucinations of voices speaking Italian despite Zak not speaking the language. Doctors recommended psychiatric evaluation, but Zak refused, insisting he needed to leave Italy immediately before the situation escalated further. The diplomatic incident that followed involved the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage filing formal complaints, the production company's legal team negotiating for return of the footage, U.S. Embassy involvement to prevent criminal charges against the crew, and ultimately a settlement where Italy would return most footage but retained certain segments they deemed too sensitive or disrespectful to Italian cultural heritage to allow broadcast. The specific content of the restricted footage has never been publicly disclosed. Italian authorities permanently revoked any future filming permissions for Poveglia Island and instituted even stricter access restrictions. The island remains completely off limits, and the Ghost Adventures investigation remains the last time any television crew was allowed there. When Ghost Adventures finally received the majority of their Poveglia Island footage back from Italian authorities after weeks of legal negotiations, they discovered that significant portions had been permanently confiscated by the Italian government with no possibility of return or appeal. The Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage provided only vague justification, stating that certain footage violated terms of the agreement, showed disrespect to Italian cultural heritage, or contained sensitive content that could not be broadcast. To this day, the specific content of the confiscated footage remains unknown to the public, and possibly even to most of the Ghost Adventures crew, since the footage was seized before they could fully review it themselves. Based on what Aaron and Nick have discussed in interviews over the years, the restricted footage likely includes extended footage from inside the bell tower showing Zak's behavior before his collapse and whatever occurred during the moments leading up to the fall, audio recordings that captured voices or sounds in Italian that authorities deemed too disturbing or disrespectful to the dead, thermal imaging and other evidence from the crematorium area that showed activity Italian officials believed should not be shared publicly, and potentially footage from restricted areas that the crew accessed in violation of their agreement. The episode that eventually aired about the Poveglia investigation was heavily edited compared to the original 3 days of filming. Entire segments were removed. The bell tower incident was shown only briefly with minimal detail about what actually occurred inside. Zak's medical crisis on the first night was downplayed significantly. The full extent of evidence captured was not shown. Even years later, when Ghost Adventures has released extended director's cuts or bonus footage from other investigations, nothing additional from Poveglia has ever been released. The restrictions appear to be permanent and legally binding. Zak has stated in multiple interviews that Poveglia Island was the most evil location he has ever investigated, surpassing even locations like the Demon House that came years later. He has said that something about the island itself, the soil saturated with human remains, the centuries of suffering and death, the experimental horrors of the psychiatric hospital, created an environment where normal rules didn't apply and where the barrier between the living and whatever exists after death had been permanently damaged. Nick Groff, who left Ghost Adventures in 2014, has mentioned Poveglia as one of the primary reasons he became more cautious about paranormal investigation and ultimately decided to step back from the aggressive confrontational style that had defined the show's approach. He stated that what he witnessed at Poveglia, particularly what happened to Zak in the bell tower, convinced him that some locations are genuinely dangerous in ways that go beyond jump scares and theatrical television. Aaron has been more circumspect about discussing Poveglia in detail, but has acknowledged that it remains one of the investigations that affected him most personally, and that still generates nightmares years later. Following Poveglia, Zak developed chronic respiratory problems including constant sinus infections, breathing difficulties, and chest pressure that doctors cannot explain despite testing. He experiences what he describes as tasting death in his throat, a metallic flavor connected to Poveglia. Psychologically, Zak reports heightened paranormal sensitivity, frequent nightmares about the island, intrusive suicidal thoughts he recognizes as external, and occasionally seeing the face that looked through his eyes in the bell tower appearing in mirrors. Spiritual authorities suggest he experienced possession that left residual effects. Despite multiple cleansing rituals and protective measures, Zak acknowledges something changed fundamentally during those 8 minutes in the tower that will likely never completely heal. He wears protective amulets and follows spiritual protocols to prevent worse attacks.